It is a little after midnight and the sodium lights over the scrapyard in Munhwadong have just kicked on over about 60 cars parked nose out in 3 crooked rows. You can hear the transformer humming behind the fence. There is a film of grime on the windshields of the ones at the back, the ones nobody walks to anymore. And if you drag a finger across the glass, you can tell how long a car has been sitting there without asking a single person a single question. Some of these cars have been standing on that gravel since before the Chuseok holiday. The batteries are dead. The tires have gone flat on one side. And every one of them still has a folded paper tucked under the wiper with a number written on it in red pen, a number that has not moved by a single one since the night the car was towed in. That is the part that gets people talking. The car is clearly never getting reclaimed. The man who runs the yard clearly knows it is never getting reclaimed, and the number on that paper sits there like it is carved into the hood. So the story goes around the neighborhood that Boss Beck is being stubborn, that he holds the line out of pride, or greed, or some kind of understanding with the other crews to keep debts high until everyone just gives up and pays. I have heard that theory more times than I can count, and I want to be straight with you right at the start. It is not really true. Not the way people mean it. The real answer is stranger, and honestly worse. By the time a car rolls into that yard, most of the number on that paper was already decided by people who will never once set foot in Munhwadong, in ways the collector standing next to the fence could not undo even if he wanted to. Some of that debt is money Boss Beck never sees a piece of. Some of it is a fee that is baked into every single loan the family writes, one he is not permitted to touch. And the one number that explains almost the entire operation is not the figure on the paper at all. It is 9,001 a day. I have spent a long time listening to people who worked inside rooms like this one, and I can tell you the thing that surprises people most is how little of that number the man in the tracksuit standing by the gate actually controls. Stay with me, and by the end of this you will be able to look at a row of impounded cars and read the whole story of it, why one of them has not moved in 4 months, why the discount a desperate borrower gets offered is smaller than it sounds, and which cars in that yard the boss would genuinely rather let rust for another year than let go of cheap. There is one number buried in the middle of all this that should make you angry, properly angry, because it climbed 40% in a single year and there is not a single collector in the entire organization with the authority to shave a one off it. We will get there. Let me take the premise apart first, because the version everyone repeats on the street is only about half right. Here is the thing you need to understand before any of the rest of it makes sense. A car sitting in that yard does not belong to Boss Beck. Not really. He borrowed the money that put it there. Inside the family, they call it the line, a running account the crew draws against with the people who actually finance the operation, a shadow syndicate 2 provinces away that everyone just calls the head house. Forget the term if you want. What it actually is the world's ugliest credit card, and it has a herd of repossessed sedans sitting on it. The moment a car gets towed in against a defaulted loan, the clock starts, and interest runs on it every single day until somebody either redeems it or it gets sold off. Boss Beck does not pull that money from a safe under his desk. He is renting that car from the head house, day after day, and when it finally moves, he pays down that one entry and the meter stops. That is where 9,001 a day comes from. That was the average carrying cost on a piece of seized collateral in the first stretch of last year, and it had drifted down by a few hundred by autumn, call it roughly 8,500 a day, forever, until the car is gone. Now do the arithmetic nobody in that neighborhood ever bothers to do. A car that sits for 90 days has burned somewhere around 760,000 of pure interest just existing on gravel, doing nothing, being a car. And that number matters, because it is the exact pressure everybody assumes is going to break the boss's nerve. But look at the scale of it. 760,000 of carrying cost against a repossessed sedan that would move, quietly, for around 80 million. That is the entire leverage. That is the full, thundering financial punishment for letting a car rot in that yard for 3 months. It is real. It stings a little. It is nowhere close to enough to make anyone forgive you 10 million won. The old collectors understood this better than the ledger keepers who replaced them. There is a saying that gets repeated in that world: your first offer on an aging car is your best offer. And the reason is that the interest is not what actually hurts. What hurts is the car getting older while a newer model rolls in next to it, worth more, moving faster. Age is the enemy, not the interest. The interest is just the clock ticking so nobody forgets there's a clock at all. So before we go any further, let's deal with the word rotting, because the honest version of this story is more useful than the dramatic one. Is the yard genuinely overflowing? Some yards are. Across the handful of crews working the western docks last spring, there were roughly 1,100 pieces of seized collateral sitting on various lots at once, which works out to something close to 78 days of average holding time, and that is right in the range the old-timers consider completely normal. The traditional rule of thumb in that world has always been about 75 days, 60 sitting, 15 more moving through paperwork. So the average is not a crisis. The average is Tuesday. But averages lie, and they lie hardest at the extremes. The fast-moving crews down at the port were clearing collateral in about 22 days on average, quickest of anyone working the coast. A mid-sized outfit up in the market district was running closer to 40. And then you get to the other end of the ledger, where Boss Beck's own family, the Beco crew, was sitting on more than double the regional average, at somewhere around 160 days on their slowest moving pieces. Same city, same season. One crew is nearly cleared out. Another one is drowning in gravel and grime. Here's the part that ruins the clean version of the story, though. If you actually looked at what was sitting the longest across every crew in the region, you would not find ordinary sedans at the top of that list. You would find a scattering of oddball collateral nobody wanted in the first place, a repossessed delivery van at 290 days, a busted karaoke sound rig at over a year, a half-share in a defunct Noribang that nobody could even legally resell. The sedans that show up near the top of the slow list are the strange ones too, a stretch limousine seized off a wedding hall operator at 220 days, a heavy cargo truck at 182. Read that again, because it tells you exactly where the actual rot is sitting. It is in the odd stuff, the collateral nobody in the neighborhood actually wants. Meanwhile the ordinary loans, small shop owners, market stall debts, the everyday flagship sedans people borrow against, those clear fast. In fact, last December alone, the Beco crew and its two closest partner crews moved more than 400 pieces of ordinary collateral in a single month, the best month the whole territory had seen in 5 years. The combined value that changed hands crossed 11 billion won in 30 days, for the first time ever recorded by anyone keeping count. So no, the ordinary debt is not dying on that yard. What is happening is quieter and more interesting. Loan volume against ordinary sedans grew only about 2.5% over the year before, well under what the family expected, while small loans, motorbikes, delivery scooters, pawned electronics, jumped more than 12%. People still need money. They are getting priced out of the big loans and stepping down to something smaller. The cars that genuinely sit are the loaded ones, the top trim imports, the 70 and 80 million won sedans that got seized off borrowers who never should have been approved in the first place, sitting in a yard in a neighborhood where nobody could afford to redeem one even if they wanted to. Alright, so why does the number on that paper never move? Let me walk you through the machinery piece by piece, because there are 5 separate reasons, and they stack on top of each other. Reason 1, the money in that debt is not where you think it is. You assume the figure on the paper is what the family actually collects. It is not. Between the loan and the payout sits a stack of arrangements the borrower never sees. There is a skim, typically 2 to 3% of every loan, that gets folded back to the head house and only returned to Boss Beck's crew once the collateral finally clears. There is what the old-timers call family cash, a bonus paid out by the head house on specific categories of collateral, anywhere from $500,000 to $3 million a unit, and a borrower only ever sees a sliver of that if the boss chooses to hand it over. There is what amounts to carrying assistance, where the head house quietly covers part of that daily interest we just talked about. And there are volume bonuses, paid quarterly for hitting a target, which is exactly why a crew will sometimes clear the last 3 cars of the month at what looks like a loss and smile the whole time doing it. He is not settling a debt. He is buying a bonus. Reason 2, the front-end margin on an ordinary loan is thinner than the neighborhood believes. The real cut the Beco crew keeps on a typical piece of seized collateral runs somewhere between 1 and 2.5% of its value. Stack in the skim, the family cash, the carrying assistance, and you might climb closer to 3 or 4%, but only if the crew is hitting its numbers. Take out the collector's cut, the muscle on retainer, the bribes to keep the lot quiet, the interest owed to the head house, and what is actually left as clean profit is often somewhere between $400,000 and $900,000. A decade and a half ago, that same margin ran closer to $3 million a unit. It has been cut by more than half. I will be straight about what that means, because I am not here to make Boss Beck out to be a saint. On an ordinary small loan, when a collector tells a debtor there is genuinely no room to move, there is a real chance he is telling the truth. On a seized luxury sedan with every option box checked, that same sentence is theater. The room in the deal scales with the size of the loan, and the crew knows exactly which pieces of collateral have room and which do not. That is why they will bend on the cheap motorbike and go completely rigid on the imported sedan. Reason 3, and this is the big one, the real money moved to the back of the house. When the front-end margin got cut in half, the business did not shrink. It relocated. It moved into what the crew privately calls the second contract, the paperwork a desperate borrower signs after the loan amount is already agreed on. The refinancing fee. The protection premium tacked onto every renewal. The forced insurance on the collateral itself. A crew that was clearing $1,200,000 per loan in that second contract a decade ago needs to clear $2 million now just to stand still, and that changes everything about how a collector negotiates with a borrower standing in front of him. If the real profit lives in the paperwork rather than in the collateral, then holding the number on that debt firm is not stubbornness, it is strategy. They will hold the total and get remarkably flexible about the weekly payment instead, because the payment is where they can bury the rest of the whole arrangement. Stretch the term, roll the old debt into the new one, add the protection, and the debt on paper never moves, and yet somehow the borrower walks out of that room feeling like he got a break. Look at what has happened to the weekly figure across the territory. Last spring, 1 in 5 borrowers renewing with any crew on the Western Docks signed a weekly payment north of $180,000, tying the highest share anyone had ever recorded. The average payment across every crew hit $140,000 a week, a new record, 3rd record season running. Nobody agrees to $180,000 weekly payment. People agree to a loan and discover the payment afterward. Reason 4 is the one I told you would make you angry. Every loan the Beco crew writes carries a fixed line item, folded into every single contract, that the collectors call the head tax. It is not negotiable. It is not something Boss Beck decides. It goes straight through him to the head house, untouched. Last year, that line item climbed 40% in a single stretch. Over the past 7 years, it has climbed roughly 80% on the crew's ordinary loans and closer to 60% on their small loan business. Based on volume alone, that one increase is worth something in the neighborhood of $1,100 million a year flowing straight through the territory and out to the head house. Here is why it matters, and it is not trivia. That tax is written into the contract before Boss Beck ever sees the borrower's face. The collector standing at your door has no authority to discount it, because it is not his to discount. So when the cost of running the whole operation went up, a chunk of that increase got parked in the one place on the contract that neither the borrower nor the local crew can touch. That is not some grand conspiracy. That is just somebody 2 provinces away being clever with a pen. But it means part of the reason your debt will not come down is that part of your debt was never actually in the room with you. Reason 5 is the pipeline itself. Starting the year before last, a joint task force out of the provincial prosecutor's office put real pressure on cash-heavy operations across the coast, and every crew working that territory absorbed the cost of moving money more carefully, cleaner fronts, slower transfers, more people on retainer just to keep the books quiet. The BICO crew alone is estimated to have absorbed something on the order of several $100 million in additional overhead from that pressure in a single year. That money has to come from somewhere. And here is where it gets interesting, comparing what new borrowers were quoted against what borrowers actually ended up paying. The quoted figure rose about 10%, but what people actually handed over only rose about 6%. Sit with that gap. The difference, roughly 4%, got absorbed through negotiation and plain competitive pressure from rival crews, which means the crews have genuinely been discounting. You just cannot see it, because they have been discounting against a number that ran away from them faster than they could chase it down. The figure you are quoted today is already a cut. It just does not feel like one, because the starting point moved first. Now let me show you the piece that ties the whole thing together, and it is the piece almost nobody outside that world ever understands. You would assume a crew sitting on 160 days of unmoved collateral would be desperate to unload it, throwing discounts at anyone who walks through the gate. It is not. Last spring, the BICO crew was offering roughly 6.5% off the face value of its slowest moving collateral, while the regional average across every crew was closer to 7%. The crew with the most unsold cars on gravel in the entire territory was discounting less than crews with a fraction of their problem. That looks insane until you understand what a real discount actually costs an operation like this. Cut 2 or 3 million off one seized sedan and you move it this week. You also tell every other debtor in the neighborhood that the collateral against their own loan is worth less than they were told, which makes every existing loan in the territory look shakier, which makes the head house nervous about the whole book, which makes the crew's own lenders start asking harder questions. A deep discount is a loan against your own reputation. The old bosses knew this, which is why incentive spending across every crew on that coast has averaged only about 7% of loan value for the past several years running, and the big, loaded pieces of collateral sit right at the top of that range without ever really breaking past it. So the answer to why they let it sit is simple, and it is not pride. They ran the numbers and decided that a car rusting in the yard at $8,500 a day is cheaper, in every way that matters, than a car sold off cheap. There's one more thing I want to show you before we get to what actually matters, because it is the trap almost everyone in that neighborhood walks into without noticing. Close to 3 in every 10 borrowers renewing a loan against a piece of collateral last spring were already underwater on it, meaning what they still owed was more than the collateral itself was worth. The average gap was just under $900,000, a record for that season. And the debt sitting deepest underwater were not the small loans. They were the flagship sedan loans, the ones that were supposed to be safest, the ones people borrowed against precisely because everyone said a good car holds its value. What happened is that the average underwater debt in that pile is now about 4 years old, which points straight back to loans written during a tight stretch when collateral values were inflated and everyone was borrowing at the top of the market. Those borrowers did nothing especially foolish. They borrowed at the top of a cycle they did not create. 4 years later, the math caught up with them. And when that old shortfall gets rolled into a fresh loan, the weekly payment jumps from $140,000 to something closer to $170,000. Over the life of that new debt, they are projected to hand over roughly $2 million in pure interest, against about $1,200,000 for a borrower who never rolled anything over. That is the real price of the loan. Not the number on the paper. Not the discount you fought for on a Tuesday night in the collector's office. So here's the part that actually matters. Ask yourself, who benefits from a debt that is heavy and never gets forgiven? You'll find the answer is basically everyone except the person paying it. The head house benefits, because a heavy figure with disciplined, rare discounting protects the value of every other piece of collateral on their books across the whole coast, and props up every other loan the family has written. There is no money in a cheap debt. There is a great deal of money in an expensive one that holds its number. The lenders further up benefit, because the bigger the debt, the longer the term, and the longer the term, the more interest. A borrower who rolls old debt into new debt pays roughly $1 million more in interest than one who does not. That is not an accident. That is the whole design. Boss Beck benefits in ways that have nothing to do with the number on the paper at all. He makes his real money in the renewal room, and then in the quiet fronts that keep his crew fed for years afterward, the karaoke rooms and the construction outfit and the noodle shop that all somehow stay open no matter how bad business looks, because a debtor is roughly 3 times more likely to come back through that door than anyone assumes, and generates thousands of one in service 4 years after the original loan. The car in the yard was the front door. It was never the profit. And the head house's own accountants benefit from a fee structure where the real increase lives inside a tax nobody local is allowed to negotiate, bundled into a contract that ties the one thing a borrower actually needed to 3 things he never asked for. There is no villain in a black coat here. Nobody sat in a room and decided to ruin anyone. What happened is that every single participant, acting perfectly rationally in his own interest, built a machine where the cheapest possible outcome for the borrower is the worst possible outcome for everyone standing above him in the chain. So the machine does not deliver it. The car sits, the boss shrugs, and the neighborhood tells itself he's just greedy, which is the most comfortable explanation and the least useful one. The uncomfortable version is that the debt was never really being negotiated. It was being managed, and the borrower was never actually sitting at that table. I think about what a debt used to look like in that neighborhood, and it bothers me more than it probably should. A generation ago, a working man could borrow against a used sedan for a fraction of what the same paperwork costs today, and the whole transaction was done on a handshake in a market stall, plain and honest, the kind of debt you paid off in a season and never thought about again. That world is completely inverted now. A loan against an ordinary flagship car runs into the tens of millions, while the average loan across the whole territory sits well below that. The debt became the luxury item. It grew a second contract and a weekly renewal fee and a forced insurance line, and somewhere along the way it stopped being something a working person borrowed against a car and started being something a working person financed against the next 7 years of his life. I am not against a family protecting itself. Real collateral standards keep genuinely reckless lending out of a neighborhood, and that is not nothing. But a debt that most people can only survive by borrowing against years of their own future has quietly stopped being a debt. And when the thing you owe money on ends up owning a piece of everything you do afterward, something has gone sideways that no amount of polish on the paperwork is going to fix. So here's what I want you to actually take from all of this. First, if you are ever staring down a number like this, stop arguing over the weekly payment and start pinning down the true total, every fee, every renewal charge, written down, out loud, in front of a witness if you can manage it. The moment you anchor on the full figure, all the clever places to hide money stop working nearly as well. Second, ask directly which part of the number is the fixed, untouchable cut and which part is actually negotiable, because there is almost always a piece that genuinely can move, and a piece that never will, and confusing the two is how people end up rolling debt they never needed to roll. Third, find out, if you possibly can, how long the specific piece of collateral behind your loan has actually been sitting. An ordinary loan and an exotic one are 2 completely different negotiations, and the leverage is almost never where people assume. Fourth, never roll old shortfall into a new loan if there is any way on this earth to avoid it. that decision follows a person for years and costs more than anything you could ever win arguing over the original number. Fifth, if the only number anyone wants to discuss with you is the weekly payment, that tells you exactly where they are trying to hide the rest of the arrangement, politely, firmly, drag the conversation back to the total. And sixth, remember the clock. Every piece of collateral sitting in a yard like that is costing somebody roughly 8,501 a day, and the end of a season, the end of a quarter, is when that arithmetic gets loudest, and the closest thing to real leverage anyone in that room is ever going to get. If you are ever in a position to walk away from a table like that entirely and find help through legitimate channels instead, that is always the better 90 days. Do that, and here is what changes. You walk past a fenced yard on a cold night, you see a row of cars going quietly to rust under sodium light, and instead of feeling either angry or hopeless, you feel something far more useful. You feel like you understand it. You know what that car is costing the crew to keep. You know what the head tax means and why the man at the gate can never touch it. You know which piece of collateral is holding the real profit and which one is not. And when a collector comes back from the office with a face like he just buried someone, you'll know whether that's the truth, or the second act of the same old play. Now tell me something in the comments, and be specific, because these are the ones I actually read, and they are most of the reason I keep making these. If you have ever seen a debt like this up close, a family member, a neighbor, a story passed down from someone who lived through it, tell me roughly where, and roughly how it ended. Because a debt like this in a coastal fishing town and the same debt in the middle of Seoul are two entirely different animals, and I want to hear the difference from people who actually know it. If you found this one useful, subscribe, because the next story goes somewhere I've been wanting to go for a long time. Next time we're going after the phrase, interest-free first month, the line every crew like this one uses to get a borrower in the door, the one that somehow always turns out to mean interest-free only for exactly as long as the crew is still deciding whether you're worth the trouble. I've got the internal renewal schedule. I've got what the second contract actually looks like once you get past the first page. And I've got a pretty good idea of who decided that a grace period was an unnecessary expense. Until then, next time you walk past a fenced yard full of cars nobody is ever coming back for, take a good look at those rows. That's not stubbornness sitting out there under the lights. That's arithmetic. And now you can read it.